Yeah, hello and welcome to our lecture series on climate protection. So we have this lecture today, and then in May there will take place no lecture at all, and then it starts again in June. Yeah, today our guest is Julian Emmanuel Benda. Julian Benda works in the team with Esther Blanco at the Department of Public Finance at the University of Innsbruck. Yeah, we had already a lecture from Esther Blanco last winter semester. She presented a lecture on cooperation for conservation on natural resources. This lecture is also recorded, so if you are interested, you can watch it on our YouTube channel. Yeah, but now to Julian Benda. He works also with economic experiments in the field of behavior and environmental economics on special topics such as cooperation in social dilemmas and collective action problems. The worldwide climate crisis is definitely such a wicked problem and a social dilemma which calls for collective actions. In his presentation today, he will talk about carbon pricing. Who supports carbon pricing in Austria? Welcome, Julian Benda. Welcome.
Thank you, Rainer, for the introduction. So, hi everyone. Really happy to be here. I am presenting a study that we did on carbon pricing. Just as a little note, I was hoping to come here and be able to present some nice results of what we did, but somehow the study did not exactly go as we planned. So maybe this will be also a chance to show you a little bit what can go wrong when doing scientific research and how to maybe think about it better and what could be a next approach for it. So let's maybe start with the question. I'm talking about carbon pricing. So what is carbon pricing? Well, in a world without carbon pricing, we have firms that produce goods, and by producing goods, they create carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. And these emissions, they have a cost for everyone else in the society as well. Think of, for instance, having dirtier air. It's like less pleasant. There's a reduction in well-being for everyone, which is basically a cost. But there can be also economic costs, like for example, if pollution creates, for example, lung diseases, you need to buy medicine, you need to go to the doctor, this costs you money, and this is a cost that is not carried by those who created the emissions in the first place. So that's what we call in economic jargon an externality. These are costs that are generated by some economic activity, but they are not carried by those who generated. And since they are not carried by those who generated, the atmosphere in a case like this can be seen as a free dumping ground for pollution. It doesn't cost anything. Firms can produce goods and they pollute and they don't care about it. And this leads to, like it has been in the past century or two, to an economic development that is very intensive in carbon emissions, with the consequences that we all know. In first place, the climate crisis, but also economic costs, as I was saying, associated to pollution. They've been estimated by the UNFCCC that there are about 4.2 million deaths a year associated to pollution, and an economic cost of about $3 trillion a year. So that's definitely the externality I was talking about. As you can see, there's a loss of well-being, in this case a very extreme one, the loss of life, and also an economic cost associated to it. So carbon pricing is actually a proposed way to try to internalize these costs and make them be carried by those who generate them. And in practice, it is simply a tax. So I will use the terms carbon pricing and carbon tax interchangeably. I mean exactly the same thing by both in this lecture. And it's basically a tax that is imposed on companies or individuals for emitting CO2 or other greenhouse gases, or let's say the carbon equivalent into the atmosphere. So how does this carbon tax or carbon pricing work? Basically, in its simplest form, the government decides to introduce a tax on emitted units of CO2. Usually this emitted unit is a ton. What happens is that the companies producing goods that generate these emissions, they have an increased cost of production, which forces them to increase the price of the products they are selling. And this means that the goods that are more intensive in emissions, they become more expensive relative to similar goods that have lower emissions. And as such, lower emission goods become more attractive for consumers because they cost less. And this means that consumers, through this increased cost, they will switch to buying less emission intensive goods. At the same time, also this tax means that the more dirty or the more emissions the production efforts of a firm is, the more tax they're gonna have to pay, and this creates the incentives for the industries as well to switch to greener or cleaner production methods. And so, in theory, the result of it is that greenhouse gas emission falls both in consumption, so consumers will buy greener goods, as well as in the industry. The production practices will become cleaner. So the goal of carbon pricing is to reduce carbon emissions, as we said, by making it more costly to pollute. And this happens by creating this economic incentive, as I just explained, both for the industry to switch to less pollution-intensive practices, and as well for consumer to switch their consumption from dirtier towards cleaner products. And this, in the long run, induces a behavioral change, both in the industry and in the consumers, which will, in the long term, switch to greener technologies, more energy efficient. Also habits, in the case of consumers, they might choose to, for example, take the bike instead of a car, or an electric car instead of a petrol one, etc. So, of course, a tax being a tax, it generates funds for the environment, for the government, sorry, because the government receives the money for this from this tax, and this money can be used or reinvested to invest in climate change solutions, research and development for greener technologies, green subsidies for the industry, and so forth. However, it is important to remember that a CO2 tax is considered environmental and green not because it generates revenues that can be used for environmental purposes, but it constitutes an environmental. It is considered environmental because it generates this change in investments and this change in behavior that is pro-environmental. Even if we took the revenues and we did not use them at all, we threw them away, there would still be a reduction in emissions associated with the CO2 tax. The goal of the tax is to reduce emissions, yes, but in the most possible efficient way. So by increasing the cost of pollution, it incentivizes both individuals and businesses to shift their behavior and change their habits, but by the incentive structure of the economy itself, everyone is going to try to do so in the cheapest possible way for them. As such, reducing the efficiency loss associated with the tax to a minimum. In fact, carbon pricing is recognized by most economists not only as the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also as one of the most simple and straightforward to implement. and that costs the least to implement. And it's generally constitutes a relatively important part of any policy mix or policy package that is put in place in any government that aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is the case in the EU, in Austria. It is also considered by the International Panel on Climate Change as a good way to reduce emissions as part of the nationally determined contributions of the Paris Agreement. And yeah, so it's considered a relatively quick and easy way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, there can be potential issues to be taken into account. Economists usually working with theory say, okay, this is what we do, this is going to be the result, but there are things that can go wrong. First and foremost, the first is the estimation of the damages resulting from greenhouse gas emissions. So these externalities that I was talking about, the costs that are carried by individuals other than those who produced. This estimation, the tax needs to be set at the level that is sufficiently high to cover these external costs, or what we call the social cost of the emissions, in order to create enough incentives to generate a sufficiently big shift in the behavior of firms and individuals to internalize this cost. And this is generically not happening. So the taxes that are in place at the moment, for the most part, they're too low to really do enough to really internalize this cost. Furthermore, there can be fairness concerns also, because a tax, for example, I don't know, a tax on fuels, on petrol, that is of, I don't know, 5 cents per liter of petrol, for example, will disproportionately affect people who have a lower level of income, whereas other higher earning individuals could find it like not having such a big effect on them, and as such, this a tax of this kind can be considered as being unfair towards low income individuals. And similarly, with this line of thought as well, there can be ethical concerns in the sense that a tax of this kind and the increasing price, let's say, put on pollution can be seen as a price to pay in order to have the right to continue polluting. If I'm, for example, a very high income kind of person, I can say, okay, there's now this tax on petrol, I can afford it, I pay it, and so now I don't need to worry about, I did my part and I can continue driving with my SUV, or I can continue taking my private jet wherever I want. And this is ethically wrong. But as we will see, there are ways around this to address these two issues. So one problem linked to carbon pricing and carbon taxing policies is that they suffer from quite a low degree of social acceptance. Just to give you an example, in Switzerland in 2021, there was a rejection by popular vote of an initiative to increase the existing price of CO2. I'm Swiss, I come from Switzerland. I was in Switzerland in 2021. I remember this voting. You might be aware there's a very direct form of democracy in Switzerland where every 3 or 4 months people are called to vote on any type of new policy or initiatives from the government, etc. And so there was a proposal by the government to increase the carbon tax from, I don't remember exactly, but it was quite a substantial amount, and it ended up being put to the popular vote, and it got rejected. People voted against it. If I remember correctly, it wasn't by a huge amount. It was like maybe 52 or 53% of voters rejected it, but nevertheless, it goes to show that even a policy proposal that is beneficial and that is meant to be good for the environment can be easily rejected. Or maybe a bit more strikingly, you probably also remember the Gilets jaunes uprising in France a few years before that. Basically, these uprisings, they evolved to become a relatively large protest on a large number of issues, but they started because of a proposal of President Macron to introduce a tax on fossil fuels. And people felt this was unfair. They were already paying enough taxes. Maybe low-income people were struggling enough, and they did not agree with it, and they went out on the street, and it became this huge movement that ultimately led to the government to not implement the tax. The economic literature has identified several reasons why that might be the case, behavioral reasons. The first of these, let's say, main conclusions is what we call tax aversion. So people simply do not like to pay tax. It's extra money that you need to pay that you don't have anymore. Nobody is happy to be taxed, and so they don't want extra taxes. But that's not the only reason. There's also fairness concerns. I was saying before, people might feel that low-income individuals, for example, are disproportionately affected by this type of tax. But very interestingly, there's a paper also that's quite recent that showed that maybe the lack of support for this type of policy also comes from the fact that people don't know a lot about it. I think they did a massive survey across thousands and thousands of people in, I think, over 60 countries. And they showed that increasing the knowledge of people about this type of policies had an effect in their support. If they knew more about the tax, that the support would increase. It was not a huge effect, but still it showed that this is also a reason why people might not support carbon taxation, is because they don't quite understand the costs and benefits of it. And finally, also not unimportant, it shows distrust in the government is also an important factor. Of course, if I don't trust my government, I'm not happy to give them some of my money to supposedly do something that's good. And so that's also a barrier. And this leads to actually only about a quarter of global emissions being covered by some sort of carbon pricing policy or carbon tax. And the price, or let's say the level of this tax, is systematically below what I was saying, the social cost of carbon. So the actual cost that is carried in terms of well-being, but also economic cost that is carried by society. So what can we do in order to increase the acceptability of carbon pricing? So one idea is to use the revenue from the tax, so the revenue that the government receives from the tax, for purposes that are beneficial and desirable. Maybe if this revenue is used for something good, then people will support the taxing more. That's what it's called earmarking, using the revenue for something specific. Examples of environmental earmarking of this kind are environmental spending, by which the revenues of the tax can be used to invest in green projects, can be used for green subsidies, can be used or invested in research and development to develop new green technologies and so forth. Another thing is, another way of earmarking is simply tax cuts. So we create this carbon taxing policy, but as a consequence, we at the same time reduce taxes somewhere else, for example, income taxes or other types of taxes, so that people don't get the feeling that they're paying more, but that they're just paying for something different, which is environmentally beneficial. And finally, another way is direct transfers, by which we take the revenue of the tax and we simply distribute it back to the population, which can happen in a few different ways, as we will see. But this last way, direct transfers, what we call carbon dividends is the name of it, has been suggested in the literature as a really good way to generate and to maintain public support for this type of policies. So how do these carbon dividends work? As I said, the tax generates some revenue for the government, and the government distributes this revenue back to the population and sometimes businesses. It's normally distributed equally among everyone. There's some variations. Maybe, for example, it can be regressive, meaning that low-income households, for example, receive more than high-income households. This, for example, to address the fairness concerns that we had before. Yeah, this means, what does it mean? It means that everyone pays a tax based on their emissions. And at the same time, they receive back the average, let's say, of all payments. Because if we take the whole of the revenue from the carbon tax and we divide it in equal parts for everyone, everyone receives the average. That means that someone who emits very few has very few emissions and pays very little tax will receive as a carbon dividend a higher amount than what they paid. And at the same time, in the other direction, someone who generates a lot of emissions through their behavior will pay in tax more than what they receive. Interestingly enough, the generation of greenhouse gas emissions or of carbon is quite strongly correlated with income, which makes sense. We know people, for example, millionaires who have private jets, they tend to fly around a lot and generate a lot of emissions. They might have bigger cars that generate a lot of emissions, etc., etc. And so usually it goes quite hand in hand that higher income people generate more emissions, which is good because that means that higher income people also pay more taxes. Here we can see in the graph, for example, this was a graph of a study that was commissioned by the US House of Representatives, estimating what the effects of the introduction of such a policy would be in the US. And we see that on the x-axis you have income, so lowest income going to highest income. And we see that the lowest income people have the highest net benefit from this type of policy, and the highest income people have even a loss. That means that in this case, they estimated for the US population, about 70% of the population would be net beneficiaries of a policy of this kind. They would gain more money that they would pay in tax. And this is especially true for the lowest decile, so the lowest 10% with the lowest income, who would have a net gain from the tax corresponding to nearly 10% of the income, which is not indifferent. However, independently of these redistributive mechanisms, which help to address this fairness and ethical concerns that I was talking to you about, the actual main mechanism from a carbon dividend is that it creates the incentive to emit less, because the less you emit, the less tax you pay from your emission, and the higher is the net benefit that you get from a carbon benefit, from a carbon dividend of this kind. So all is good, right? We implement a carbon tax. We simply make a carbon dividend out of it. We redistribute it to the population. Most people gain from it, mostly low income and low emitters, and it creates the incentives to reduce emissions. Everyone's happy, and we support it, right? Of course, things are a bit more complex than that in reality, and empirical studies show that, in fact, the impact of carbon dividends of this kind on support for carbon pricing is quite minimal. In fact, some studies show that maybe the views of people are not only dependent on things like how much money they get out of it, they're not, but might be also dependent on other things, like, for example, previous ideologies, where they stand politically. For example, someone who's a strong neoliberalist and believes in free markets and that the state should not intervene in the economy. We can explain what we want about carbon dividends, redistributive mechanisms, and things like that. They're not necessarily going to change their mind. So partisanship also, especially nowadays where we live in where our society is becoming increasingly polarized. And there's also an increasingly identitarian aspect to policies. People feel like I am a left wing or I'm a conservative or something like this. It becomes much more difficult to change people's minds based on arguments of this kind. Also, another problem is that voters are people in many of these programs are often unaware that they're receiving a dividend of this kind. For example, in the study of Mildeberg, it's they checked what the effect of such a carbon dividend had, or knowing about such a carbon dividend had in Switzerland and in Canada. They found very little effect. And one of the reasons they give is that people are not aware that they're receiving it. For example, in Switzerland, and I'm going to stop going back to Switzerland. It's not because I'm from there, but it's a good example because I am someone who's interested in this kind of topics. And I was living there until a couple of years ago, and I was receiving this carbon dividend, and I did not know about it because the way it is redistributed back to the population is through a discount on the monthly health insurance bill that you get. So in Switzerland, you pay every month an amount for your health insurance, and you get a bill for it. And just to give you an idea, the monthly premium is about 400 euros, depends a bit on age and other things. But in the document that you get in your bill, at the end, it's written in small, okay, and then there's like a reduction of your bill due to environmental reasons of whatever, 3 euros or something like this. I mean, I've never looked at this bill in so much detail. I look, how much do I need to pay? That's the amount, and I paid it. So I did not know about it. So basically, this this empirical evidence points to the fact that the visibility of these carbon dividends, as well as political partisanship, are quite important barriers to support for this type of policies, even in the presence of carbon dividends. So let's look at the case of Austria, which is quite an interesting case study for us. In Austria, the government a few years ago in 2022 introduced this new called eco-social tax reform law, which is basically a carbon pricing policy. It is quite complex and has a lot of different aspects to it, but I'm going to try to just explain the let's say the main parts of it, the ones that are important for us to understand. And basically, it is a carbon tax that covers all the sectors that are not already covered by the EU carbon pricing policy, which is the EU emissions trading system. This EU policy is a emission trading system, means that the government gives a certain number of allowance or of permits to emit the number of CO2 tons that it is aimed for. And it distributes or sells this to the different companies. And then the companies, they are allowed to trade these permits with one another, so that one company who is maybe more efficient in reducing their emissions or has some sort of a cleaner production technology can make an extra profit by selling these permits to other industries that are more emission intensive or that cannot reduce their emissions so much. This means that in the end, the government still has this the amount of emissions that it was going for, which corresponds to the number of allowances it emitted, and the reduction efforts shift to those industries that are the most efficient in reducing their emissions. So basically, this EU policy covers some sectors, but not all of them, and the policy in Austria then covers the other ones, which are primarily transport and buildings. It is intended as a system of a fixed carbon tax for its first years of implementation, going from 30 euros per emitted ton of CO2 in 2022 and raising to 55 euros per ton in this year. And basically, after the plan is to make this also evolve into an emission trading scheme similar to the one that was in the EU, but for these other sectors, and then further from 2027 on, sort of integrate the EU policy. So this is basically a carbon, for the first 4 years, this is really a carbon tax in its most simplest form. The government decides an amount that needs to be paid in tax for each emitted unit of CO2. But of course, there's many relief measures, so there's many measures with which this revenue is used for something beneficial, and the most important of them is something that I'm hoping all of you are aware of, and that you've heard of and that you receive, and it's basically a highly visible individual lump sum dividend, so a payment from the carbon tax into your bank account. So it's basically also the most easy way of, or let's say straightforward way to redistributing this revenue. And it's also quite visible. I mean, I think all of you are aware you're receiving this Klimabonus. As I said, this is its primary objective as a carbon dividend is to address redistributive effects, to help individuals who are maybe struggling a bit more with adapting their behavior, which are incurring higher costs. Yeah, it creates the incentives through this net beneficiary or net payer dynamic to reduce emissions, both for businesses and for individuals. And in its first year of implementation, it resulted in over €1 billion redistributed back to the population. Of course, just really briefly, in its first 4 years, the carbon tax increases. It goes from 30 to 55 euros a ton. Similarly, since the Klimabonus comes from the revenue generated by this tax, it also increases. It goes from 110, just in 2023. Okay, it started in 2022. I think it was 90. I wasn't living in Austria yet, so I'm not too sure. But anyway, it's increasing its base payment from, let's say, 90 to 145 last year. And then it also accounts for regional variation on the urban to rural spectrum. The more you live in a rural area, the higher the Klimabonus you become, because it is estimated that you have, for example, less access to maybe a really good network of public transport, maybe some basic services that you need in your life, such as schools, hospitals, supermarkets, etc., are not so close by. So you are much more dependent on private transportation. And since the CO2 tax is on transportation, it will affect people living in rural areas more. But however, the thing that's important for our case, for our study, is that the Klimabonus, contrarily to the other carbon dividend policies that are found around the world, offers a very high visibility. It's this payment that we are all aware of. It's called Klimabonus. We receive it. We receive a letter in the post telling us we received it, how much this year, and then we get a payment directly onto our bank account, which, I mean, it's quite a substantial amount. I don't know, maybe you guys are lucky, but for me, if I see 200 euros fall from the sky into my bank account, it's something I notice. And so this makes it a really interesting case for us, because then we can say, okay, visibility was cited as a barrier for support to carbon pricing. And so let's see if in a case where this visibility exists, whether the results are different. So we designed a study, which basically with the objectives, first and foremost, to evaluate a bit the Austrian population's knowledge and attitudes regarding this implemented carbon taxation, and also whether they support it or not. And then to test whether knowing or making the link between the carbon tax and the Klimabonus, whether making this link explicit, whether it helps to increase support, whether if people know that the Klimabonus they're getting is due to the carbon tax, are they going to be more in favor for it? So yeah, as I already said, we focus on Austria because it's highly visible, and it's a good case to study for this. And our contribution of our study is to provide new evidence on the motivations that are behind support for carbon taxation policy. But, and this is the novelty of a study, for the first time in a context where the lump sum dividend paid back from the carbon tax is very visible. So what we did is quite a simple online survey experiment. So we worked in partnership with a survey agency here in Austria. It's simply an agency that you contact, and they run a survey of the population for you. We ran it on a representative sample of the population of about 1,600 people, and it was representative in terms of gender, in terms of age, of regional representation, and of education. And the survey of the structure was as follows. We started asking people the usual personal characteristics: gender, age, education, income, all that. Then we asked them for their political views, where they place themselves on the left to right spectrum, what party they vote for. We asked them what their environmental behavior is, for example, how often they consume meat, how often they take the plane, and things like that. And finally, we also asked them about their beliefs related to climate change, whether climate change is real, whether it's caused by humans, whether it will get worse, whether they feel it's going to affect them soon, is it already affecting? And all these questions, they're used to control, to see whether to control whether these aspects have also an effect on sport, because we can expect, for example, that someone who is already worried about climate change will have probably a high level of support for this type of policy. And then we measured the support for the existing CO2 tax, and I'm going to explain you in a minute how. And then we finished the survey with asking them 3 knowledge questions about the carbon pricing policy. So which are basically whether there's a carbon tax in Austria, what the revenues are used for, and how the money is refunded to the population. Of course, this being an experiment, there are some treatment variations. So what we want to do with this experiment is to test whether making, as I said, the links explicit, the link between the carbon tax and the Klimabonus, does it increase support? So we do this by comparing different groups with where this link is made more or less explicit, and we look, okay, does support change between these groups? So the first group is 1/3 of the sample, is the baseline group. We do not give them any type of information. We just give them a short text to read about climate change and its effects, to put them in the same mindset as the other ones, and then we measure their support and the knowledge that they have about the carbon pricing policy. Then we introduce a first treatment, which we call the tax treatment. And basically, we give them the same text to read as well. This, by the way, it's all quite short text. Is something quick, like a couple of minutes at most to read, 1 page. And then we introduce them to the existing carbon tax policy in Austria. We say there is this policy, and we explain a little bit how it works, who pays it, what are the expected benefits. And we say that in other countries, there's evidence that carbon taxes of this type have proven successful. This to test whether also the theory of just knowing how a carbon tax works or not, whether this already has an effect on support. And then we introduce the second treatment, which we call the tax plus Klimabonus treatment, where we give them exactly the same information that we give to the people in the first treatment, but we also add the information that the revenues generated from this tax, they're taken and they're redistributed back to the population via the Klimabonus, and we very explicitly mention in there, if there's no tax, there's no Klimabonus. So if you're happy with the Klimabonus, it comes from the tax. And then for these three groups, we measure support for the existing for the policy, and we want to see whether providing this information increases support. So the primary outcome measure, as I said, is support, and we measure this in three distinct ways. The first way in which we measure this, so all of the participants have these measures applied to them. The first one is a real world and incentivized support measure. Real world because it has a real consequence in the world, as we'll see in a minute, and incentivized because it has some sort of monetary economic incentive linked to it. So basically what we do is we tell people, okay, by participating in our survey, you are automatically entered into a lottery where you have the chance of being selected as one of 10 winners of 200 euros. And we ask them, if you will be selected as the winner of this lottery, how much of the winnings are you ready to donate to For Tomorrow? For Tomorrow is an organization that basically what it does is remember the EU environmental emission trading scheme I was mentioning about. There's these allowances that are given to companies and that are traded in the market. So basically this organization, it takes donations and it uses this money to buy some of these allowances and doesn't use them. So there's a permit for an emission that is not used, the emission is not generated. And as such, it reduces emissions already, but also by the laws of supply and demand of economics, the supply of available emissions becomes lower. That means it increases the market price of these allowances. And as such, I mean, it's not so important now to understand how, but the important thing is that you could understand this organization as an organization to which you can donate money, and they will use this money to sort of artificially increase the price on carbon in the EU. And we use this as a measure. The more people donate, the more they support carbon pricing. Then there's a second measure that's a real world and non-incentivized support measure. We basically present them with a letter that we wrote that we want to send to the Austrian Ministry of Environment, asking them to advocate for more carbon pricing, for a further increase in carbon pricing. And we ask the participants, if they want, they can voluntarily give us their name, and then at the end of the experiment, we will compile all these names as signatories of the letter, and we will send this letter to the ministry on their behalf as well. And then finally, we also ask them about support, so they self-report this. These are simply 3 Likert scale type questions. I'm sure you've seen surveys like this before, going from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and the questions are whether they agree with with such a CO2 tax in Austria. Do they agree with the increase that is planned already in the policy that exists from 30 to 55 euros a ton? And then whether they agree with an increase of the CO2 tax to cover its social cost. The social cost being the tax being high enough to internalize this externality, this cost carried by others than those who emitted it. And it has been estimated by the US Environment Protection Agency that a tax that would be high enough to internalize this externality is of 110 euros a ton. So double than the 55 that we will reach in Austria. We also have secondary outcome measures, which are not our main variables of interest. The first being knowledge. So we have 3 knowledge questions, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And we compile a score between 0 and 3, how many they got right, to measure the effect of the treatments on the knowledge, whether they learn anything. And then we also had some questions on attitudes and beliefs. For example, do they think this policy is fair? Do they think it disproportionately affects low-income earners? Do they think they're going to be affected too much, and so on? but this is going to be beyond the scope of this presentation. So just really briefly, you see that's the knowledge questions. As far as you know, so this copy pasted, this is how they saw it. Do you know, is there currently such a CO2 tax being levied in Austria? Yes or no? Then they answer and they get to a new screen, and then we tell them, actually there is. It's blah, blah, blah. And then we ask them, okay, do you know what the revenue of this tax is used for? And they can choose, okay, it's used to promote renewable energy. Does it go in the general budget of the government, or is it redistributed to the population? And that's, of course, the correct answer. And then in the third question, we say, okay, it's redistributed back to the population. Do you know how? And then they have these options and they can choose, hopefully, as a deposit in your bank account or check to be picked up at the post station. So these are the questions with which we measure how much they learned about what we are informing them. So let's first of all look a little bit at what is the level of support in Austria. So this here is just looking at the group in the baseline treatment. So we did not provide them any information. So this is the reflection of what would be the level of support that exists in Austria in the absence of any sort of extra information that we provide. And we see that in the case of the donations to For Tomorrow, as you remember, people were able to choose between 0 and 200, how much of their winning they wanted to give. We see that a very large share, nearly 40%, decided they would not donate anything, showing that they did not really care about this. And then still the distribution is quite heavily skewed towards the left, in the sense that most people decide to donate relatively little. In average, people were ready to donate about 26.6 euros out of the 200. And then there's, of course, some focal points around the values of 50, 100, 150, and 200, because people tend to prefer choosing round numbers over just some random number. Similarly, with a proportion of people who agreed to give their name to add to the letter to the Ministry of Environment, we see that it's, I mean, I don't want to say it's a large or small percentage, but I mean, it's definitely not the majority. It's 21.2% that agreed to add their name to the letter. And in the questions about support that they could simply answer and self-report, we have here the distribution on the Likert scale going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. We see that in the first question, which was basically, do you agree with the levying of the CO2 tax, responses are quite neutral. The highest share just said, yep, but don't really care, and it's fairly equally distributed on the two ends of the distribution. But then, quite interestingly, if we say, okay, do you also agree with the planned increase from 35 to 55 euros that is already planned as part of the policy, then people are much more agreeable. So somehow they say, yeah, I'm quite neutral about the implementation of such a policy, but I agree. I think it should increase the way it is. But then as soon as we ask them, okay, would you also agree to increase the price of carbon further, going to the social cost of carbon of 110 euros a ton, then people say, okay, no, that's maybe too much. And most people sort of disagree. Okay, so that's what support looked like in Austria for the carbon taxation. Let's see about knowledge. So as you remember, we asked them, first of all, if they know about the existence of a CO2 tax in Austria. Then dividend is whether they know what the funds are used for, whether they go government budget or redistributed, and then how they are redistributed to the population. And we see that a fairly large share of the population is aware that there's some CO2 tax of some sort, nearly 3/4 of the population. But then as soon as we ask them, okay, there's this tax, but do you know what the revenue is used for? The proportion of people getting the right answer decreases dramatically. Of course, to a certain extent, it's also due that here there were like less options to choose from, so it was more easy to get the right one by chance. But still, this is such a big difference that I mean, it still holds. And then if we ask them, okay, it's redistributed back to the population, do you know how? Then probably some people make the link. They say, okay, they're probably talking about the Klimabonus, and the level of knowledge increases a little bit more, about 1/3 of people. If we look at the knowledge score, this knowledge score is how many answers, correct answers people got. We see that the great majority, or let's say nearly half of the people got one right. And this is not very encouraging, but at the same time, it's made even worse by the fact that statistically, even if you just go randomly, you're kind of likely to get one right, right? But I think that the most important part to see is that in the absence of any informational treatment that we provide, the level of knowledge of the whole process going from the climate tax to how it's redistributed to the population is really low. It's less than 10%. So that means that over 90% of people in Austria are not really aware that that the revenue from the carbon tax was redistributed through the Klimabonus. So since in the literature we have this tends to point to the fact that knowledge is also a factor in support, that increasing the knowledge of people leads to additional support. We had to look a little bit, okay, what is the relationship? What is the correlation between the knowledge score, so how much people know about the carbon tax, and the level of support? And we see in these two graphs that for the level of donations and the share of people agreeing to give their name to add under the letter increases the more they know about the carbon policy. So the more questions they got right, the more they are likely to support carbon taxation through these measures. Of course, this is just a correlation. We cannot really draw any conclusions. We don't know anything about why that is the case, but it still seems to point towards the direction that knowing more about the whole process and how it works and how it's distributed is indeed a factor in increasing support. So we see here also the relationship between the knowledge score and the self-reported support. We see, well, it's kind of similar with little differences in the three graphs. Just for you to know, here on the y-axis we have the numbers from 0 to 4. That's the Likert scale, going from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and the red line being the 2 is the neutral. So we see that in all three cases there seems to be some sort of positive tendency between knowledge and support, even for these self-reported measures. Okay, so let's now go to our experiment and the treatment effects. So does providing additional information on how this carbon tax works and making the link between the carbon tax and the Klimabonus explicit, does it increase support? And our expectation is that informing participants about the existence of such a CO2 tax and how it works, what its benefits are, what its redistribution mechanisms are, that should already lead to a higher level of support, like in the paper I was mentioning before, where they saw that increased knowledge improves support. And then we also expect that in the second treatment, where we say, okay, this is a tax, this is how it works, and by the way, this is where the money you get from the Klimabonus comes from, this should also increase support even more. But that was definitely not the case, as you can see. So we see absolutely no difference between the baseline treatment and two informational treatments. There's a little bit of an increase, but it is statistically not significant. So it means that from a statistical perspective, these three values are basically the same. Okay, so that's one result. Looking at the so this was donations, right? The level of donations stayed still around 30 euros for all treatments. On the letter signatures, similarly, here we kind of unexpectedly even see a dip in the first treatment, but again, it's not statistically significant. So for our purposes, we can consider that it's basically a zero effect. The proportion of letters signed is the same for all treatments. And looking at the self-reported measures of support, the three questions that we have, same story again. I mean, there's like small variations, but they seem to go in random directions, and from a statistical perspective, they're not big enough differences to really make a difference. So this got us wondering a little bit, of course, and we said, okay, let's try to understand why that is the case. And the next thing we did was we said, okay, let's see if at least the people getting the informational treatments, do they learn something from the information we provide them? Do they and do they know more about the tax? And these were the results. So in the first question, we would have expected to see for treatment 1 and treatment 2, the people in these two treatments, they received the information that such a tax exists in Austria. So we would have expected to see an increase. And yet here it's almost beautiful that it's so flat, it's so perfectly flat that there's absolutely no effect whatsoever. For the other two questions, we would expect to see an effect only for treatment 2, because the knowledge about how the revenues of the tax are used, meaning redistributed back to the population, that's the one up there, and through which channel, that's the Klimabonus up here, we would have expected to see an effect only for treatment 2, because they're the ones who had this information. And of course, we do see a little bit of an effect, especially in the last one. But keep in mind that, I mean, even in the last one where it's the most evident, we go from a knowledge level of about 33% for the baseline and the first treatment to a knowledge level that is, I cannot see exactly, but around 40% or 42%. If people really had learned from the information that we gave them, this level should be, even accounting for some people who maybe didn't understand it or didn't care, but at least 90%, right? So we really see here that there's an issue with the treatment. It's not so much that it doesn't have an effect on support, but simply that it does not affect the knowledge that people have. They are not learning anything about the treatment that we provide them. And that's kind of a problem from our experimental design, because it means that we cannot measure the effect it has on support, which was our first goal. So we started thinking about, okay, what could be the possible explanations for this phenomenon? So the first one would be, what would have happened if we only saw a null effect on the support, but there had been some effect on the learning, on the knowledge. So then we could have concluded that, okay, people, they read the information, they learn about it, but they don't change their level of support, which is fine as a result in itself. And it's like it's a phenomenon that it's called belief perseverance. It's like when someone is convinced about something, and you can present them with information, you can present them with arguments, but they're not gonna change their mind, and this is fine. But this means that we should have seen at least a change in knowledge, because those who we told, for example, that there exists such a tax, they should then know. And that's not the case. So, of course, this first explanation we could reject in the first place. So we identified that the problem is at the information processing level. And this could also be due to different factors. The first is maybe it's our fault. Maybe we designed these treatments badly. Maybe the language was complicated. Maybe it wasn't clear. And people tried to read them, but did not understand them. And as such, they could not learn the information that we wanted them to learn. And they could not answer the knowledge questions correctly. A second reason could be also that participants did not take the time to read, did not care about the information. This is unfortunately a feature that happens sometimes in online experiments of this kind, because participants are paid to participate in them, and maybe they're just interested in getting the payment for it, and they just click through without really caring about anything. They read about it or don't. They just look up, there's money to be made or not, and they just go through it. So that means that there's no incentive to take the time to read and take in the information, and as such there's no learning from participants. Or a third possibility is that this has also been observed in the literature in some contexts. People are simply fed up maybe with the topic, or they're fed up with these experiments, and they go like, oh, it's the climate crisis again, and we've heard too much of it, it's all over the news. And then as a sort of a protest, they take and they respond wrongfully in order to mess with our results. So these are the three possibilities that could lead to a lack of information processing. And so what can we do next? So how can we move on from here? So the first step is to identify whether this reason for this lack of information process is because of our treatment, is because it's impossible to understand and it's difficult, or is it because one of the other two reasons, because people don't care or because they want to give wrong answers. And then as a second step, once we found out what the reason behind is, we can eventually correct our treatment in order to at least have the information process, and then we can evaluate the impact that this information has on support, which was our initial goal. So that's a little bit the stage where we're at now. We are discussing how to move on from here, how to go ahead to continue with the study. And the idea that we are toying with at the moment is to also incentivize knowledge questions. I just give here an example, but so we haven't decided anything yet on this matter, but we could, for example, say, okay, we tell participants at the beginning, you're going to be provided now with a text, which you need to read, and there's going to be some questions about it later. And for each correct question you get, you receive whatever, 20 cents, 50 cents, or something. And as such, this provides an economic incentive for people to say, okay, I'm going to take the time to read this properly and see if I can get the questions correctly. And so the outcomes of this are, the possible outcomes are three. If we see that the knowledge questions are still being answered mostly wrongly and that it has no effect on knowledge, then of course it can also, we cannot measure the effect of this information on support for the policy. And so there's something wrong with our treatment, and we need to rethink and redesign the way we present this information to participants. However, if we see, okay, after we do this, people, there's an effect of the information treatment on knowledge. People are actually learning the information that we provide them with, but there's still no effect on support, then that's fine. That's a result, because then we say, okay, we have a policy implication, and we can say, okay, presenting people with information and explaining to them how the carbon taxation policy works and how the dividend they receive from it, explaining this to them still is not enough to improve their support for CO2 pricing. And so if we want to achieve the goal as a government, as a politician, to increase support for this type of policies, then we need to look at a different way. Or alternatively, what I was hoping to present you with today when I signed up for this lecture was that, well, people learn from the information that we give them, and this has an effect on support. And we can say to politicians, hey, the problem here is people don't support this type of policies because they don't know a lot about it. Just try to find a way to inform them about it and to make them really understand that the money they're getting, the benefit from the Klima bonus, comes from the CO2 policy. That it has an effect on carbon pricing. I'm running out of time, but I'm done. So basically, the conclusion that I have is, yeah, first and foremost about the level of knowledge and support for Austria. I mean, I've explained it to you during the lecture, so and it's written there. But basically, it's also one of the conclusion is to, if you do some economic experiments of this kind, you will always fail to think about something, and there's always a chance of something going wrong. And yeah, that's updating knowledge might need more than just giving people something to read, but that you might need to create the correct incentive structure to really want them to take in this information as well as just having it in front of them. And okay, that's it for me. Thanks a lot for your attention. And I don't know if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Julian Benda. Yeah, now we can start our Q&A session. So if you want to ask something, just raise your hand and I'll come up with a microphone. And also for the online participants, just type in the chat and then we can read your question and can answer it here in the lecture hall. So yeah, any first question? Okay.
Do you think that the carbon pricing is really efficient at addressing who is most strongly affected by emissions? Because it really stays inside one country and it only affects the population of this country, but the emission of one country can really affect another country, which is not participating in any carbon pricing system. And then this disparity is still there, and the richest country are still producing as much emissions most likely, and then it's still affecting other countries and they don't see anything from the scheme.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your question. Yes, that's absolutely true. There's actually even a name for this. It's called the waterbed effect, where doing implementing carbon pricing in one country on the one side might lead to relocation of some industries to other areas, but even if they don't do, I mean, of course, the costs that are generated by the emissions in one country are also felt in other countries. I mean, we have this situation, of course, with the North-South debate within the Paris Climate Agreement. The global North has generated the most emissions, right? But it's in the end poorer countries in the global south that suffer the most the consequences from it. And that's absolutely true. So I mean, it goes a little bit beyond the topic here, because we are talking about something that is relevant for national politics. And at the same time, while it's true what you're saying, that national politics alone will not solve global problems, it is also true that maybe this would be a reason to advocate for more multilateralism, more, let's say, coordinated action among different countries. But at the same time, I think it would be the wrong conclusion to say, well, I do something in my country that's environmentally beneficial, let's say, but since we live in a bigger world where there's other countries that don't do it, then it's pointless and I don't do it. So of course, you're right, and I see your point, and I agree with it. And I think that Austria implementing this is not going to solve the problems of the world. But at the same time, Austria can do what Austria can do, and so that's a bit more the idea behind it.
Yeah, ideally it would be that the income tax, the carbon tax, would be redistributed to other countries, but this would just never be accepted, right? So it just never happen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would need to be levied from all countries as well, because I mean, if you take the 1.25 billion euros that were redistributed to the Austrian population, we received in the first year was what, 100 euros, 150 euros each. Imagine distributing this not on, how many are in Austria? 9 million people, but like on 8 billion. You know, it's everyone's going to receive €1. It doesn't really change incentives much. So I think it would need to be levied maybe at the global level create like I don't know, an alliance of carbon pricing. I don't know, but yeah, this is of course then a more global type of discussion that's absolutely valid, but which we were not addressing with this research.
So from 2026 on, it starts with this emission trading system of the European community.
Yeah, so it's quite unclear actually. I mean, I haven't read all the legal articles about it because first they're in German and I don't understand them and I'm not a lawyer and so on. But from the information that you get on government websites and things like that, I've been looking at it. It's not entirely clear exactly how they will continue to do this. So the idea is that from starting 2026, they will start a so-called transition phase towards a emission trading scheme in Austria. And then from 2027, there is going to be a sort of emission trading scheme to like number 2 in the EU that is going to cover these sectors that are currently covered by the Austrian policy. And so from 2027 on, it's going to integrate this EU-wide policy. But more details about how exactly they're going to do it and so on, I'm unfortunately not able to give you. And yeah, I've looked at it out of interest and to try to understand it, of course. But fortunately, I mean, for our research now, we were focusing on the part with a fixed price. So it's, yeah, that's.
And the price will be ramped up, so it's not starting with a really high price at the very first year, but it's increasing throughout the years.
This is part of the details that I could not find. It probably will depend on the amount of emissions that are going to be put in circulation, right? Because not emissions, allowances. Because the less allowances there is, the higher the price they're going to be. So I'm assuming that the Austrian government is planning out on defining the number of allowances that they're going to put into circulation so as to fit an estimated pricing level that they see as desirable. But yeah, how exactly they're going to do this, I don't really know.
Yeah, further questions?
You have shown us one of your first slides that more or less 70% of the people in the country they are the gainers of that system, and 30% they are not. I'm surprisingly always, if I'm talking about this topic, that this format don't have not that much support. Do you have an idea why? Because I don't need more information that I'm one of the gainers of that system, and if I'm not, I'm rich enough to do something good for the people. Do you?
So as to why there's no more support, you're saying, yeah, well, that specific graph with the 70% was an estimated, a study that was estimated the impact if they were to implement such a policy in the US. It's what I found. I don't know what the exact percentage of net gainers is here in Austria and so on. As to why there is so little support, yeah, that's what we are trying to find out, right? It's is it because there is maybe some people are already convinced about whether they like taxes or not, whether they're pro-environmental policy or not, and then we can tell them what they want, and they say, oh no, maybe they don't believe it, or maybe they say, oh, it's, you know, there's we've seen a lot of this now with this more populist rhetoric coming up in the Western countries, where there's like a little bit this bashing of experts, because economists, or like during Brexit, there was a lot of this type of things where economists were coming and were saying this is a crazy idea, this is not going to work well for the economy, it's going to be bad for everyone. And then you'd have like the populist right saying, oh, these experts, we've listened to them for 30 years and look where we're at, we just don't believe them, you know? So I think the main message is that the beliefs that people have about the efficiency or how much they support something like this are not generated by something as simple as explaining them, look, you're going to be a net beneficiary. We are humans, we have feelings, we identify with certain things, and it might be much more complicated to to convince people of that than what we're doing. And this is what we are trying to do here. We are trying to say, okay, in this unique context with a highly visible carbon dividend, which I'm assuming everyone likes, because I mean, I like getting money. And so I'm assuming everyone likes, if we make this explicit, if this policy doesn't exist, you don't get this money, is it going to increase support? Unfortunately, due to the limitation, we were not able to measure this, but hopefully, if we correct for this problem, we will be able to give an answer.
I know there exists a graphic from a scientist from the Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien, I think. It says more or less the same, that 70% of the people in Austria will gain. And that what I say, that I understand, but what I not understand is now we have it for 3 years here in Austria, and I think it's still the same in Austria that the people say, no, it's not a good system, but it's highly visible as I've shown us, and it's highly visible in a good time. I think it's because it's in the summertime when the people need the money for their holidays, and actually I don't have any idea why it's not more.
Well, the one potential answer might be that while people are aware of the Klimabonus, they seem from our survey not to be aware that it comes from the carbon tax. So we saw most people know there's a carbon tax, 75%. And then we asked them, okay, what is this revenue used for? And they were like 13% who identified that it's redistributed back to the population. So that's exactly the aim of our intervention. If we make that link explicit, then maybe it becomes the way that you're saying, you know, then people say, okay, but the Klimabonus is something good. It comes from the tax. Maybe the tax is good and I'm going to support it more. Yeah.
One question to your study. So it's somehow an overlay of pre-information by newspaper or by politics or by whatever, and your information. So the intervention was additional information, or just more or less the same information that was already existing. So it was somehow doubled. Maybe this is one reason why the separation is not so clear, because it's some doubling of information.
Yeah, so this is assuming everyone reads the newspaper and is interested in these topics. And of course, even looking at the baseline treatment, if I take the graphs out again, we see that in fact that it points towards the direction of what you're saying, right? The more someone already knows through newspaper, because here these are the people that we did not provide any information, right? The ones that know more, because they maybe read more than newspapers, are more interested in this type of topics, they tend to support more. So this is in line with our expectations, right? So at the same time, still we see that the level of, where is it? Whatever, the effect on knowledge still doesn't change, right? Because if it were true what you're saying and people already know all of that, then we should see simply a very high level of knowledge, even among these people that we did not provide any information with. But that's the case for the existence of the CO2 tax. This a lot of people know, 72%, but the rest of the information nobody knows. So it's safe to assume that if we provide them with this information, black and white written there, and we ask them a question 2 minutes later, they should be able to recall it, right? So that should lead to increased knowledge. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Further questions?
And so if you want to continue and make another study, do you have an idea of another way you could do the study, like another organism, or I don't know, real life questions to people, or other ways?
I mean, the idea is not so much to do another study, but to improve this one. So to do it again in a better way. First of all, to really see, okay, is there a problem with the way we present this information or not? One of the problems that we have is that there are not a lot of these type of survey agencies here in Austria, and we already used the sample of this one, and unscientific to reuse the same people again. So maybe we will have to think whether we use a different sample from outside the country and sort of teach them about how it works in Austria, but then it's of course a little bit more limited. So, or whether we can find maybe a different sample, or if we make a survey ourselves with students, for example, that could also be an option. So there's different options to do this. And then exactly to the main idea that we have is to incentivize the knowledge questions and say, hey, read this text carefully because you can earn some money if you answer correctly. And we hope that this is going to solve our problem that people do not learn anything from our treatment. And then we can measure whether there is an effect on support for the policy as well or not. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Doesn't look so. Then I would say thank you very much. Thank you for your lecture. Thank you for coming in the discussion. And so we'll see you in our next lecture, and then again in June. Yeah, welcome and goodbye. Thank you.
And thanks a lot for your questions as well.